There is a language more ancient than words, a language spoken in silence through glances and flickers of emotion. Look into a man's eyes, and you may see not just who he is, but who he is trying not to be. The human eye is not just an instrument of sight, it is a threshold between the conscious mind and the unconscious soul. In Jungian thought, symbols arise from the unconscious to communicate truths the ego cannot yet grasp, and the eyes function as living symbols, reflective surfaces through which deeper psychological realities are glimpsed. When a man's emotions are restrained, buried, or guarded, they often find their only exit through the gaze. The eyes betray what the mouth cannot say, not because he lacks the words, but because the psyche chooses a quieter language to communicate the unspoken. The gaze reveals layers of psychic content beneath his persona, the social mask he wears to function in the world. While his voice may sound composed and his behavior may seem disciplined, his eyes can shimmer with sorrow, narrow with resentment, or soften with vulnerability. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and the eyes become a symbolic map of the inner terrain. They flicker when touched by a memory, harden when confronted with a threat, or dim when confronted with an internal loss. These movements are not random. They are messages from within, bypassing verbal logic to offer a glimpse into the emotional undercurrents of the soul. This is because the unconscious is always active, always working, whether or not the ego is aware of it. When emotions are repressed, due to culture, trauma, or identity, the energy does not vanish. It becomes displaced, often surfacing in subtle, symbolic forms. The eyes, because they are so close to the center of awareness, become a natural conduit for these energies. A man may avoid eye contact not due to disinterest, but because his gaze would reveal too much, pain, desire, fear, that he himself may not yet fully understand. Conversely, a sustained, intense gaze may mask internal conflict, an effort to assert control over emotional chaos beneath the surface. In this way, the eyes do not lie. They do not reason or negotiate like words do. They are raw channels through which the unconscious tries to make itself visible. To observe the eyes is to witness the psyche in motion, to catch a glimpse of what has not yet reached the surface of awareness. When language fails or is repressed, the gaze continues the dialogue, offering not answers, but archetypal clues. The eyes, then, are not just for seeing. They are also for being seen, even by the parts of the self that one fears the most. From a Jungian perspective, much of the male emotional world is shaped not by inner freedom, but by inherited patterns, collective expectations imposed by culture, family, and society. These expectations form what Jung called the persona, the social mask adopted to navigate the world. For many men, this persona is constructed around control, stoicism, and detachment from feeling. Emotional expression is not merely discouraged, it is often equated with weakness, instability, or loss of identity. As a result, feelings that arise within the unconscious are not allowed to surface directly. They must find alternate routes of expression, routes that bypass language and challenge no social code. The eyes become one of these secret routes. The male psyche, trained to internalize emotional states, redirects its affect inward. Yet the unconscious does not willingly submit to suppression. Its contents leak through symbols, images, and bodily expressions, and the eyes become vessels for these hidden truths. A fleeting glance of pain, a momentary flicker of warmth, a gaze that lingers too long in silence, All of these are unconscious disclosures. In such moments, the emotional reality breaks through the mask. He may speak rationally, even coldly, but his eyes carry the burden of unexpressed grief, fear, affection, or longing. This duality, the persona and the hidden emotional life, creates tension. The greater the internal pressure to appear unaffected, the more powerfully the suppressed content accumulates in the unconscious. Over time, the psyche learns to allow brief, symbolic releases through gestures that appear insignificant but are loaded with meaning. The gaze, because of its subtlety, becomes a perfect channel. It does not violate the social code, yet it allows a glimpse into the emotional depth that lies beneath the surface. It is a compromise between what must remain hidden and what desperately needs to be seen. In this way, the eye language of men becomes a kind of emotional code, shaped not by personal intention, but by the collective archetypes that surround masculinity. These archetypes demand control, and the psyche complies, but not without cost. Emotional truth, when denied expression, finds ways to emerge symbolically. The gaze becomes a quiet rebellion, a moment of authenticity in a landscape dominated by repression. It is through the eyes that the unconscious sends its messages, not to invite sympathy, but to preserve integrity, revealing, even for an instant, the living soul beneath the armor of identity. The shadow, as Jung described it, is the unconscious repository of all that the ego refuses to accept. Traits, memories, impulses, and emotional truths buried because they conflict with the identity one wishes to uphold. In the male psyche, the shadow is often shaped by years of emotional suppression and internalized ideals about what is acceptable to feel or express. While the conscious mind works to maintain control, the shadow does not remain silent. It leaks, and one of the most telling places it reveals itself is in the eyes. The gaze becomes a subtle stage where this inner conflict plays out. Revealing flashes of truth the conscious self seeks to conceal. A man may maintain a calm exterior, speak with composure, and show no overt signs of emotional struggle, but the unconscious finds expression in the smallest involuntary gestures. His eyes may momentarily harden when a memory is triggered, glaze over in emotional retreat, or narrow with resentment that he himself does not fully acknowledge. These expressions are not calculated. They are eruptions from the shadow, the psyche's way of making visible what the persona refuses to integrate. In that flicker of intensity or retreat, something buried is trying to surface. The eyes carry this contradiction. They hold the tension between what is consciously accepted and what is unconsciously disowned. A man who has not made peace with his inner world may struggle to sustain eye contact, or he may use his gaze to deflect, intimidate, or shield. In each case, the eyes reflect a deeper emotional architecture, one that is not linear or logical, but archetypal and symbolic. The shadow is not simply negative. It is rich with feeling, full of truth, but often wrapped in fear and shame. The moment a man's gaze falters or intensifies without cause, it is often the shadow speaking. See me. I am still here. To observe the shadow in the eyes is not to judge, but to understand the human condition. No one escapes the burden of the unconscious. The more fiercely one tries to control it, the more powerfully it asserts itself in subtle, symbolic forms. The eyes become the space where this drama unfolds, not in words or conscious gestures, but in raw glimpses of the rejected self. In those moments the soul seeks not approval, but recognition, a silent plea to no longer remain hidden. Eye contact is one of the most psychologically exposing acts a person can engage in, and for many men it is also one of the most controlled. The gaze is not just about looking, it is about being seen. To hold someone's gaze means to permit access, to allow another to witness not only the surface, but the inner life beneath it. For a man who has learned to guard his emotional world, the gaze becomes a battleground between vulnerability and control. The eyes are windows, and he knows that. He knows they reveal what his words have trained themselves to conceal, so he learns to manage them with precision, not to deceive, but to survive within a framework that demands composure, distance, and detachment from inner truth. When a man sustains eye contact, it can be an act of calculated strength, a form of measured vulnerability. He offers just enough to appear engaged, but not so much that he risks emotional exposure. It is a negotiation with his own psyche, a tension between the impulse to connect and the instinct to protect. This tension is often unconscious, shaped by years of internalized messaging that tells him to remain composed, impenetrable, rational. The eyes, however, know otherwise. They reveal tremors beneath the calm, truths beneath the posture, and so he limits their expression, gazes briefly, looks away, or holds still as a shield. On the other side of this dynamic lies avoidance. The refusal to meet someone's eyes is not always indifference. It is sometimes the result of feeling seen too clearly, too deeply, in ways that pierce through the persona. Eye avoidance can be a form of psychic self-protection. To avoid looking is to avoid confrontation, not just with the other, but with the self. What he fears might not be judgment, but recognition of an emotion he has not allowed himself to name, recognition of a longing he cannot admit, recognition of his own emotional hunger masked by strength. These patterns are rarely conscious. They are part of the deeper architecture of the male psyche, shaped by archetypes of strength, self-control, and rational detachment. The gaze, then, becomes both a weapon and a shield, a way to assert power or retreat from truth. In either case, it is not just a gesture of the eyes, but a movement of the soul. What seems like a glance may actually be the psyche negotiating how much of itself it is willing to reveal. The eyes speak a language far older than words, a symbolic communication rooted in the unconscious. Long before speech was developed, humans relied on facial expression and subtle physical cues to convey feeling, threat, desire, or trust. This ancient form of emotional communication has not vanished. It now hides beneath the surface of social behavior, especially in men trained to suppress verbal vulnerability. Micro-expressions, those fleeting involuntary shifts in the eyes, become the last remaining truth-tellers in a psyche governed by restraint. A blink that lingers, a pupil that dilates unexpectedly, a shift in gaze that disrupts an otherwise calm demeanor. These small moments bypass the ego and reveal the emotional content buried beneath it. Unlike conscious expressions, micro-expressions cannot be rehearsed or controlled. They are triggered by the unconscious in real time, often in response to internal emotional shifts. For a man who has learned to maintain a composed facade, this means his eyes may betray him in moments of emotional activation. He may speak casually, even indifferently, but a sudden flicker of sorrow, surprise, or tension crosses his face in a fraction of a second. The unconscious does not hide. It pulses through the body, and the eyes serve as its most reliable outlet. These signals do not lie. They speak before language intervenes, before thought can censor feeling. The reason these micro-expressions carry such weight is because they emerge from emotional truth. The body always knows what the mind refuses to admit. In Jungian terms, they are expressions of the self breaking through the defenses of the persona. The self seeks integration, wholeness, and truth, and it will speak in any way it can, even through a flicker of the eyelid or the soft tremble of a stare. For the man who guards his emotional interior, this can feel like exposure, even when no words are spoken. He may not be consciously aware of what he has revealed, but the psyche always knows. It leaves breadcrumbs for those who are willing to see. These involuntary signs are not performances, but revelations. They are not offered, they escape. They are the psyche's accidental confessions, slipping through the cracks of the mask. In every glance, too brief to name, there is a story unfolding, not of who he wants to be, but of who he truly is beneath the architecture of control. To witness these signals is to see not a failure of strength, but a moment of truth. When a man averts his gaze, it is easy to misinterpret the act as indifference or emotional absence. Yet in Jungian psychology, avoidance is rarely so simple. The unconscious often speaks through what is not done, what is withheld, or what remains unexpressed. An averted gaze may in fact be a profound symbol of internal conflict, a signal that something within the psyche is stirring, something too vulnerable, too raw, or too fragmented to bring into direct awareness. The refusal to meet another's eyes is not always about the other person. It is more often about an encounter with one's own inner world, which, in that moment, feels too threatening to face. The eyes are mirrors, and to lock gazes is to risk seeing and being seen in return. For many men, whose emotional lives are shaped by early conditioning that discourages openness, eye contact can feel like a form of psychological exposure. When he looks away, it may be a defense against this exposure, not because he lacks feeling, but because the weight of those feelings has no safe container within his conscious mind. The gaze carries the power to activate memories, wounds, and suppress desires. To avoid it is to delay that confrontation, to shield the ego from what the unconscious is not yet ready to integrate. This avoidance often masks deep-seated emotional themes, shame, guilt, fear of judgment, or unresolved trauma. Jung believed that the psyche contains a moral compass within the unconscious, and when a person acts in ways that contradict their deeper values or feelings, that contradiction surfaces as psychic discomfort. In the case of the averted gaze, it may be that the man is experiencing a rupture between his emotional truth and the image he must maintain. Rather than reveal that rupture through the eyes, he turns away, not in deception, but in psychic protection. Symbolically, the averted gaze becomes a language of defense, a silent way of saying, "I am not ready to face this," or "I cannot hold this truth in front of you." It is the unconscious negotiating the limits of emotional exposure. What appears as distance is often the symptom of depth, a signal that something within is still in the shadows. The avoidance is not an absence of feeling, but the presence of too much feeling, feeling that has not yet been made safe, named, or understood. The silence of the eyes speaks, and what it says depends not on what is seen, but on what remains hidden. What we call eye contact is not simply a social exchange. It is the collision of two inner worlds, filtered through centuries of collective conditioning and unconscious protection. When a man hides his feelings, it is rarely because he feels nothing. It is often because the architecture of his psyche has been built around silence. His gaze becomes a channel, a leak, a symbol through which forbidden emotions, unspoken truths, and fragments of the shadow slip into the light for a fleeting moment. In that quiet language of the eyes, everything that words cannot carry is silently transmitted: sorrow, longing, restraint, and the ache of an inner world that has never been fully permitted to speak. To truly see that is not just to decode another, It is to awaken within ourselves the capacity to witness the soul behind the mask, because in the eyes, the unconscious does not hide. It waits, patiently, for recognition